I must say, I think the rod bayonet about as poor an invention as I ever saw. As you observed, it broke off as soon as hit with even moderate violence. It would have no moral effect and mighty little physical effect. This ramrod bayonet business does not make me think we can afford to trust too much to theory. January 4th, 1905, Theodore Roosevelt. Thanks for tuning in to another video on forgotten weapons. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of their guns from the upcoming December of 2016 premiere auction. And what we have today in front of us here is a rod bayonet model of 1903 Springfield rifle. These were, well, production was halted when Theodore Roosevelt, as Secretary of War, sent that letter to the Ordnance Department. And he was right. The rod bayonet was really a pretty terrible idea. Now, where it came from is kind of interesting, because when this rifle was designed, it had replaced the standard long sword pattern bayonet of the Krag rifle with this rod bayonet. You might wonder, well, why would they do that? The answer was, interestingly, something that we still hear to this very day, which is that the Ordnance Department had come to the conclusion that the bayonet was pretty much outmoded. It was old-fashioned, it really wasn't used anymore, and it just wasn't necessary. Having this big long bayonet hanging off of your cartridge belt was just a pain for soldiers. It got in the way, it was clumsy. You really didn't need it. Why are we going to encumber these guys with this extra piece of useless kit? Instead, let's make it a multifunctional thing. We'll use literally the ramrod, which you would use for cleaning the rifle, will double as the bayonet. We'll put a spike on one end. You never have to carry it on your person. It just resides in the rifle. Presto. It's lighter, it's simpler, it's easier. Everything's better, right? Well, Theodore Roosevelt was of the opinion that the bayonet was not obsolete, that it was still necessary, that, as he said in that quote, you need it for moral effect as well as actually stabbing people. And he told them basically, nope, halt, cut that out, put a real bayonet on this thing. And that's what they went on to do. Now, it's interesting that this was coming just before World War I, which to this day we think of as a fixed bayonets kind of war. And yet, in 1901, 1902, 1903, when this rifle was in development, the Ordnance Department already thought that bayonets were obsolete. Well, it's interesting. Maybe when we hear people say that bayonets are obsolete today, maybe they're right. Maybe it's the same thing happening all over again. At any rate, I do want to talk about some other elements to the 1903 Springfield here. We have, what's interesting, this model of the rifle was manufactured from 1903 until 1905. Just for a couple years. And the rod bayonet is not the only thing that changed about it. There were a number of other substantial changes, one of them being the rear sight, more significant one probably being the cartridge. Right about the same time that they were getting rid of the rod bayonet, they were also replacing the cartridge, going from the original 30-03 or 30 caliber 1903 cartridge to the newer 30 caliber 1906 cartridge, or as we know it today, the 30-06. The major change there was going from a heavy round-nosed bullet to a lighter spitzer or pointed bullet. This was, the original bullet was a 220 grain bullet. It was fired at about 2,300 feet per second. What's interesting is, while that cartridge was in development as well, the French and the Germans were both using lighter pointed bullets. And the US looked at these and deliberately avoided them. The common belief of the day, at least in the US, as reported in a couple of major shooting magazines at the time, was that a light bullet like that would have too much wind drift. And you were really much better off for accurate fire to have a heavier bullet that would better resist wind. Well, it turns out they weren't right, and it only took a couple years before Ordnance realized this Spitzer thing really is the way to go. The 30-06 replaced that 220 grain bullet with a 150 grain bullet, so it's a substantial reduction in weight, 30% reduction in weight, and bumped the velocity up from 2,300 to 2,750, or to 2,700. So reasonably substantial increase in velocity. Among the other things, that had a substantial change on the range of the rifles. So ultimately, the 1903 Springfield would have a rear sight graded out to 2,850 yards, where this early one, which is still in 30-03, only goes out to 2,000 yards. So almost a 50% increase in effective range because of the flatter shooting trajectory of the Spitzer bullets. Now, there are two big elements that I want to talk about regarding this rifle. One is heat treating and exploding receivers, and one is the US government paying money to Mauser for patent infringement. And neither of these things is quite what most people expect. So let's start with the patents. when this rifle was first adopted, the U.S. Ordnance Department recognized that, you know, hey, there are some elements to this that might be covered by some of Mauser's patents. And in fact, this is very similar to a Mauser. This, for all practical purposes, this is a Mauser action. So they sent notification to Mauser and basically said, hey, we adopted a rifle that we think might be covered by some of your stuff. So have your patent attorney call us and we'll negotiate out some royalties. Mauser did exactly that. Turned out there were 7 different patents that were covered, that Mauser owned, that were used by this rifle. Not just the rifle, but also the clips. In fact, the clips were a substantial part of it. The US basically used Mauser stripper clips in this thing. So the Ordnance Department and Mauser's patent attorneys talked back and forth. They came to a very amicable agreement for a certain royalty per rifle and a royalty per 1,000 clips manufactured, up to a maximum of $200,000. And the US was making these rifles fast. By 1904, production was 400 guns per day at Springfield and 125 per day at the Rock Island Arsenal. It was only 1909 when they had actually manufactured enough of the guns and the clips that they had maxed out that $200,000 patent amount to Mauser. So they sent the last payment over. Everyone's happy. Mauser's happy. The US government's happy. No big deal. Just after that happens in 1909, the US government is contacted by the DWM company, also German, and DWM has a patent on the Spitzer bullet. And DWM says, hey, we noticed that you've been making a whole lot of Spitzer bullets, like 250 million of them. And by the way, that infringes on our patent that we've had on that concept. And so you owe us a crap ton of money, something on the order of another $250,000. And the Ordnance Department had considered this and had not done anything about it because their lawyers assured them that this patent wasn't valid, because the Ordnance Department had some documented testing that some of their own officers had done on pointed bullets as far back as 1894. So rather than treat this very amicably like they had with Mauser, the Ordnance Department simply refused any attempts at negotiation with DWM because, in their view, that claim was totally invalid. Now, this did eventually work its way into the court system, and early 1914, this finally gets into court. Well, of course, the middle of 1914, World War I breaks out. At that point, the case is still pending. However, there's a commission set up in the US government to look at the assets of enemy combatants in the United States. And what they did is they looked at this Spitzer bullet patent and basically said, yoink, that's ours now. We're nationalizing it, we're taking it, it's ours. Therefore, this court case is now moot. No point to it because now it's our patent, so we don't owe royalties to ourselves. Done, over, that's it. And that would have been it, except that after the war ended in 1921, there's another commission set up to look at the treatment of, again, now they're looking at, now the war's over and we have a bunch of German and Austrian citizens who are in the US, or American citizens who are also German and Austrian citizens with dual citizenship, or all these issues of how do we deal with these people's assets because of the war and things that happened. That committee takes a look at this specific case, among many others, and determines that the seizure of the patent was illegal and unfounded. And for that reason, they fine the US government $300,000 plus interest. And by the time this is finally paid in 1928, it's like $112,000 of interest that have accrued. So DWM ended up getting a payment of about $412,000 from the US government, not actually because their patent was infringed by this rifle, but because of kind of a technicality that the patent was improperly seized by the US government. So there are more details than that, but that's the full story of, did the US pay the German government patent royalties on the 1903 Springfield? And the answer is, well, sort of, yes, and also sort of, no, they got money, but not necessarily for the reasons everyone thinks. The second major element that comes up with these rifles is, do they explode? There's a lot of common knowledge out there about the 1903 rifles with low serial numbers and how they're dangerous and they should not be fired. What's the real story? Well, there is truth to this. Rock Island Arsenal guns with serial numbers under 250,000 and Springfield Arsenal guns with serial numbers under 800,000 are generally considered dangerous and should not be fired. This is an issue that came to light in 1917, and it's interesting, it was actually Major or General Julian Hatcher, I think Major at the time, who did a lot of the work on this. They received some reports about rifles blowing up, and Hatcher was able to figure out that this was probably a heat treating issue, and he clamped some brand new production receivers in a vise and whacked them with a hammer, and lo and behold, a bunch of them shattered. That's not supposed to happen. The whole point of heat treating a receiver is you take this raw, soft steel, and you do all the machining when it's soft, when it's easy to cut, and then you heat treat it. And what heat treating does is actually change the crystalline structure of the steel, and it makes it harder. However, there's a scale of things. The harder something gets, often the more brittle it gets. For example, glass is pretty hard. It's harder to scratch than a lot of things. However, you don't have to hit it very hard for it to just shatter and break. The same thing applies to steel. What it turned out was going on was the receiver heat treating process at Springfield was based on you heat the gun to a certain temperature for a certain time and then you quench it in oil. The problem was they didn't actually have what were called pyrometers, which was an early form of thermometer, in the ovens. They relied on skilled, experienced workmen who could look at the steel and tell by eye, by the color of the steel, what color of reddish orange it was turning, what the temperature was. So there were some real problems with this process. The biggest one, the one that really had an impact on it, was the sun. The difference between a sunny day and a cloudy day would impact how bright the steel looked in the furnace. And you could get variations of up to like 300 degrees in the actual temperature of the receiver, all in a range where the workers thought that they were at the correct temperature. And this led to a substantial number of receivers being heated too hot, which led to a crystalline structure that was far too brittle. Those are the receivers that would shatter when you hit them with a hammer. And a lot of these guns would have been weeded out because every rifle that came out was proof tested, and a 70,000 PSI proof load followed by a full clip of standard rounds. Any rifle that had really serious problems in the receiver heat treat would blow up when they did that to it, and it would be scrapped right there at the factory. However, there was still this group of rifles that got through the proof test process, but were still overly brittle. And that wasn't really a problem prior to the war because they were being shot with really good ammunition and everything worked fine. The problem was during the war, when ammunition production really cranked up, ammunition quality dropped. And where you had problems with the poorly heat-treated receivers was actually when you had poor ammunition. The cases that were found during World War I of these rifles exploding were all cases where the cartridge case, the brass cartridge case, ruptured. The brass was too soft or it cracked. When the cartridge case failed and gas got into direct contact with the receiver, that is when the overly brittle receivers would actually explode or fracture. That's where the problem was. So this isn't quite as fundamentally catastrophic as people think because the proof testing took care of all the really bad rifles. The problem came when you combine the overly brittle heat treat with really bad ammunition. As a result of this, the US did come to a conclusion that all of these rifles, these low serial number rifles, should be pulled out of service. And they did that. What's interesting, they were pulled out of service when they came in for any sort of work. So a few of them did actually trickle through and were still used as late as World War II. Presumably, if one went that far, you can pretty safely assume that it doesn't really have any problems. It's probably fine. It's not that all of these low number receivers are bad, it's that all of the low number receivers have the potential to be bad. And by 1917, when the Hatcher wrote his report on this whole problem, the arsenals brought in some metallurgy experts and they went through a bunch of options and came up with a new process for heat treating. They installed pyrometers and they fixed the situation. So the guns that don't have these specific low serial numbers are just fine. They actually changed to a two-stage heat treat process. They had better control of temperatures and much improved. The early guns, like for example this one, which is serial number 11,578, does certainly have the potential to have a really poor heat treat and might be too brittle. So to be on the safe side, I would say don't shoot one of these early guns. Although if one is to look at the actual likelihood of a catastrophic failure with one, especially if you use reasonable quality ammunition, it's probably, at this point, pretty infinitesimally low. On the other hand, we're talking about some pretty darn early guns. These are all World War I or earlier guns. So if you've got one of those in good condition, maybe you don't want to be shooting it even if it is totally safe, simply because you want to preserve it in its current quality. So we're going long here. I hope you guys don't mind. I do want to cover a little bit more In fact, I want to cover the specifics of the details of these early 1905 and earlier guns, because that's how they differ from the 1903 Springfields that most people are familiar with. All right, we'll start with the serial number and the markings here. Pretty cool. This is definitely something that they changed later on. U.S. Springfield Armory, model of 1903. Serial number here is 11,578. So this is extremely early. If you consider that once they got production really ramped up, they were making 400 guns a day. That's not very many weeks before they hit 11,500. Now, one of our early variations here is this rear sight, which is basically taken from the Krag rifle. It's just a flat tangent sight, very much different from what would be adopted in 1905 for the 1906 pattern guns. We have two things here. We have a range slider. Now there are a couple different versions of this rear sight. This one just has 100-yard increments. The other version does actually have 25-yard increments marked out on the rear sight blade. So what you would do is move this to your preferred range, say 800, and then you tighten this screw down to lock it in place. Then we also have windage adjustment here. You can see we have that little center marker, and as I turn this screw, I can adjust the windage back and forth. Now, one other feature of this early rear sight is that it actually gave you the option for either a notch or a peep sight. This is just a flat piece of sheet metal that slides up and down. It's got two little detents there. So this notch sight here is pretty small. It's pretty similar to the standard modern pattern 1903, the later one. This peep sight is so tiny as to be almost literally useless. You have to cram your face way up forward on the gun in order to even be able to see anything through that minuscule little hole. I have to believe that the only practical purpose for this thing would be shooting the national match rifle course, where you can in fact adopt basically a high power style of totally impractical shooting position, squeeze your face way up against the bolt, probably have some leather wrapped around the cocking knobs so that you don't clobber yourself in the nose every time you fire, and then line this thing up with the black bullseye from a national match target. This thing would be totally useless in actual combat. Leave that thing folded down. Now the namesake of this rifle, of course, is the rod bayonet. You'll notice that the front sight assembly, the front sight block here, is pretty distinctive with those two holes. They would change that with the later pattern guns because, of course, they had to add a bayonet lug to the front sight block when they did that. For this one, what we have is this little button underneath. Press that in, and it releases the bayonet, which we can then bring out to that point where it snaps. There's our bayonet. I think Roosevelt was pretty much spot on when he said that that thing is going to have pretty minimal moral and physical effect. This is not a particularly sturdy bayonet. It will definitely not survive vigorous usage, let's put it that way. Now if I push the button in again, I can pull this the rest of the way out, and there we have it. It is now long enough to function as a cleaning rod. So in theory, you get two purposes out of it. It's also a lot heavier than a normal cleaning rod because it has to be large enough in diameter to be at least somewhat plausible as a bayonet. So the tip of this thing does have 3 flutes in it, and it comes to sort of more or less a point. This is basically like stabbing someone with a screwdriver, having this thing on the rifle. You'll notice the handguard on these is smaller. It's lower profile than you'd have on the later pattern guns after 1906. This rifle has a really nice sharp cartouche on it here. You'll notice it's dated 1904, and we have our inspector's initials on there. We also have the cartouche on the wrist of the gun. Pretty slick there. One last little bit of interesting, I think at least interesting information here. When the US was developing this rifle, they had a number of experimental designs in 1900 and 1901 and even 1902. And at that time, the standard barrel length was 30 inches for a rifle and 22 inches for a carbine. That's what the Krag had been. And these rifles, they had decided only to do one length, and they experimented with a number of different lengths and they ended up adopting 24 inches as the standard length overall for everybody. The cavalry would get these, the infantry would also get them. And what I find interesting is this is a pattern that you would see in a lot of countries, leaving behind the very long barrels, which had been appropriate for black powder in particular, where a longer barrel length really did give you more effect on the bullet. But then transitioning to kind of a standard short rifle. You would see that with the Germans, with the Kar-98 AZ, and of course the Kar-98K in World War II. You'd see it with the British. You'll notice the Enfield is called a short magazine Lee-Enfield. That short is because it was a standard short rifle, a little bit longer than a carbine, but shorter than the standard infantry rifle. And the US was, for once, an early adopter of this concept with the 1903 Springfield. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. I know we went over a lot of stuff. This ended up being a longer video than I had planned, but I think it's all pretty interesting material. There's a lot going on with these early guns that a lot of people don't know about or are potentially misinformed about, and it's honestly, I really like the look of the early ones as well. So if you have a standard post-1906-03 Springfield, maybe you'd like to have an early version to go along with it, keep it company in the safe. If that's the case, do take a look at the link in the description text below. That will take you to Rock Island's catalog page on this rifle, and you can take a look at their pictures and their description, place a bid on it online or over the phone or here in person if you'd like. And if you're really interested in these, in this auction, they also have serial number 91 with a bunch of early experimental features on it. So take a look through the catalog, check out that one as well if you like. Thanks for watching.